This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello. No, it's not him. This is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a 007 themed episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Film Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, behind-the-scenes stories, marketing stories, trying to make a James Bond film in double quick time stories, all the bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films that I choose for this podcast tend to have more of a mainstream leaning than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. I just try and celebrate the fact it's really difficult to get a film made. And I just want to celebrate the fact that people have managed it. They've certainly made one more than me. One thing before we get going as well, I'm absolutely delighted that this podcast episode has been sponsored once again by the wonderful folks at cinemaparadiso.co.uk. If you've not heard of them, they are a physical media, DVD, Blu-ray and 4K rental firm here in the UK. They've got over 100,000 titles. They ship out their films via Royal Mail as well. They've got subscription packages starting from £5.99 a month, and I'll have a special code for you at the halfway point of the podcast. I really love physical media, and I'm really chuffed that they're sponsoring this podcast. I'm going to start then with the first of the two movies. I'm going to go back to 1997 to a particularly rushed production. We've got a lot of story to get through, but I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer first. Story comes the other side of this.
Action stations.
Aye, aye, sir. Sound the general alarm.
The Chinese pilot insists we're inside their territorial waters and he will fire.
An act of violence.
Torpedo, torpedo, torpedo.
It was an unprovoked attack on a ship in international waters.
The promise of war.
And instead of decisive action, all you want to do is
My
investigate.
goal is to prevent World War III, Admiral.
Now, the world has only one chance for peace.
When will our ships be in position?
48 hours.
And just one man for the job.
Bond. James Bond.
How much do you know about Elliot Carver, 007?
Worldwide media baron. Owns newspapers, radio, satellite TV.
There's no news like bad news.
I understand you once had a relationship with Carver's wife.
Was it something I said?
How about the words, "I'll be right back"? I'm from the New China News Agency.
Looking for a news story?
Could have taken care of him.
Let the mayhem begin.
Yep, well, he ain't kidding you there. That was a clip from 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies, Pierce Brosnan's second film as James Bond 007. Also in the cast with him on this one, Jonathan Pryce, who you just heard at the end of that clip, Michelle Yeoh, Terry Hatcher, Joe Don Baker and Judi Dench. Script for this one credited solely to Bruce Fierstein, but we're coming to that, and directed by Roger Spottiswoode. But the story of what became Tomorrow Never Dies, well, it began even before 1995's successful James Bond reboot, relaunch, whatever you want to call it, GoldenEye. The GoldenEye, which I've covered before on this podcast, came out in November of 1995, and that was after a 6-year absence for 007 from the big screen. Now, parent company MGM didn't want that again, and thus, even before GoldenEye had finished filming, it was clear that plans for a further James Bond adventure adventure were being accelerated. And there's some sense to that. I mean, this time there wasn't there wasn't any umming and ahhing about who was going to be playing 007 in the next film. Pierce Brosnan was at least going to get 2 bites at this. Something was going to have to go very drastically wrong for his adventures in the Tux not to continue. But what was going on in the background wasn't a creative problem, it was a business problem that not for the first time in stories that I've covered on my podcast, there were issues with a parent company, in this case MGM, and MGM's lack of finances, something that would haunt the firm, has done for pretty much ever since to varying degrees. At this point in the mid-90s, it was under new owners. The new owners wanted to take the stock public. And in the midst of that, at the point it was looking to float the shares of the company, well, the one big asset that MGM had, the one big franchise that looked bankable, was James Bond. Now, it hadn't been proven at this point that GoldenEye was going to be a huge hit or anything like that. But what it was keen to demonstrate was that it could churn out another James Bond film a lot quicker than it had managed to get the last one to the screen. A 6-year gap this time, well, that was just not an option. That the 007 adventures would need to become a lot more regular. MGM wasn't awash with money, and that included production funds to make the film anyway, but it needed Bond. And then when GoldenEye did prove to be a success, well, it needed Bond even more. Suddenly, it wasn't just the only key asset, it was a hugely profitable one as well, with GoldenEye clearing some 9 figures in profit for the companies concerned. So it was in May 1995, 6 months before the release of GoldenEye, that the movie that became Tomorrow Never Dies was given the go-ahead. However, in 1996, the middle of 1996, a huge loss in the James Bond family, that the legendary producer behind the series, Albert R. Cubby Broccoli, he died in June of 1996, and this was going to be the first Bond film that he wouldn't be involved in. By this point, the $200,000 had been spent on getting a script going. It was a script that wouldn't officially be finished until 2 weeks before the end of physical production, coming to that story. But nonetheless, novelist Donald Westlake got the job in the summer of 1995 of writing the first treatment for the new James Bond film. And so he generated a couple of ideas. They didn't really pass muster with the bosses, who were now Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli. But one of the ideas that he put in was the idea of a Hong Kong setting. And this was bubbling up anyway, because at the end of the decade, the sovereignty of Hong Kong was going to pass back from Britain to China at the end of 1999. And so Westlake figured that that's something that they could tap into. Nonetheless, his ideas didn't go much further than that. Now, Bruce Feirstein, who'd come to the rescue with the script for GoldenEye, he would see Cubby Broccoli just before he died, and he would pitch him a slightly different story, with a villain being a media mogul. Feirstein had been inspired by watching cable news networks, and this was in the mid-90s when they weren't quite as radical as they are now. I'm putting that very gently, I think. But he saw how one story had been described in 2 wildly different ways on different cable networks, who have exactly the same collection of facts, just with completely different spins on them. And so he liked tapping into that as a potential Bond villain thing, a media mogul who controlled the messaging of the world. He would be insistent that the template for this was more Robert Maxwell, the late media mogul in the UK, Robert Maxwell, rather than Rupert Murdoch. But nonetheless, the cap sort of seemed to fit either way. Now, I should point out at this stage, I'm using all sorts of sources to pull this story together. The Premiere magazine from around the time of the film's release. I've used Total Films Set Visit from around the time of release as well. A couple of online articles that I found on my sorted travels, which I'll quote as I go along. I have to give a credit to the excellent book Some Kind of Hero as well, by Matthew Field and AJ Chowdhury. I've cited it, but I really think if you're a Bond fan, that's a great book to dig out. And the late Desmond Llewellyn's biography, Q, I'm referring to that once or twice throughout this as well. So going back to Bruce Feirstein, he got this idea of the media mogul. He put it to Cubby Broccoli. Broccoli liked the idea of it, which was really his last input at that point into the movie. And so there were at least the ingredients there that they could go ahead in getting a script together. The thing was, underpinning all of this was an urgency being driven by MGM. And Eon Productions, the company that oversees Bond, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson running it at this point, had gone through numerous owners of MGM throughout their time making Bond films. And this time they were feeling a particular commercial and time pressure on it. So first and foremost, they needed, with the script going, they needed someone to come in and direct the film. And the incumbent was Martin Campbell, who had directed Goldeneye and would basically be offered every Pierce Brosnan James Bond film from that point onwards. He was certainly offered Tomorrow Never Dies, but he didn't at that stage like the idea of doing two 007 movies back to back, and instead he committed to make a film, The Mask of Zorro, which again I've talked about on a previous podcast. Now, Roger Spottiswoode, who'd worked with Sam Peckinpah and gone on to make films like Air America and Turner and Hooch and Stop or My Mum Will Shoot as well. I don't think that was the one that landed him the gig. But he'd previously been in talks to do a 007 movie in the 90s, but nothing had come to that. That was back at the start of the 90s. But he continued to build up his own directorial credits. And 14 months before Tomorrow Never Dies, 15 months, was due for release, he was announced as the director of the new James Bond film. Reportedly next in line was Vic Armstrong, the second unit director on the film, and infamous stuntman as well. And Vic Armstrong's biography I should cite as well, really well worth digging out. Spottiswoode, in fact, would also reach out to Vic Armstrong and basically apologise for taking the job, but Armstrong agreed to do second unit work, and it would be Armstrong who shot, for instance, the extensive pre-credit sequence that we get in the movie. However, jumping ahead a little bit, because within a month of jumping aboard the film, Spottiswoode realised the script had sizable problems, and those sizable problems needed fixing. And as Variety reported in December 1996, and this was 12 months before release, after a month on the job, Spottiswoode convinced Eon and United Artists, part of MGM, to fly 7 Hollywood screenwriters to London for a weekend brainstorming session. Now, apparently they flew first class, but they weren't paid for the work. The brainstormers were required to sign waivers to circumvent Writers Guild of America rules discouraging, quote, table writing, unquote. And that's the kind of TV round table style of writing that's becoming slightly more commonplace in movies now. But it was made clear that no writing was to be done, and for the writers concerned to treat it as a free weekend in London. And so amongst the people who were recruited for this special session were Robert Collector, who wrote the film Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Nicholas Meyer, Star Trek fans will need no introduction to him. He directed Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 6. Also, Time After Time. I really need to come to that. Daniel Petrie Jr., who'd penned Beverly Hills Cop, had also directed the 1991 film Toy Soldiers, which I like an awful lot. And then there was David Campbell Wilson. And this group of people came together. And the big challenge that they faced wasn't rewriting the script per se, but they needed something to film, because really in January, so let's assume this took place in November 1996, by January 1997 they needed to be filming at least one of the big action sequences for the movie, because otherwise they'd just have no chance of getting this movie complete. Now, of that collection of writers who came together, Nicholas Meyer was hired to do some rewrite and polishing work on the script, and then after they'd all had their input, Bruce Fierstein then came in and did a further polish, and he had 30 days at that point to get the script into some kind of order. In the backdrop of all of this, Pierce Brosnan was particularly unhappy about how things were going, that he found it ludicrous, and he wasn't the only one, that they didn't have a completed script on the eve of so close to the start of production. And when you consider the amount of pre-production, the amount of work involved in mounting a James Bond film, not least with all the extensive stunt work involved, it seemed particularly testing, let's just put it delicately like that the film had got itself into such a state. Then there was also, of course, the story of the title, and there's two different versions of how Tomorrow Never Dies came to be Tomorrow Never Dies, because I think it's pretty well known that the original name that people were gravitating towards was Tomorrow Never Lies. Now, Roger Spottiswoode would tell James Bond 007.se website that a list was sent via fax to MGM in Burbank, and someone simply misread it, and he was quoted as saying the guy who received the script must have misread it, because the next day we had a phone call from MGM telling us, "We love your title, Tomorrow Never Dies, that's going to be it." There's a slightly less exciting version of the tale, which was just someone who the title was being dictated over the phone and the typist misheard it. But either way, Tomorrow Never Lies, well, now Tomorrow Never Dies, there was a title. And in fact, even as the film was in production, a trailer was put together, and it was an announcement trailer, just a footage of Brosnan as Bond just doing his introductory bit, but the whole point of the trailer was to announce the movie he's filming at this point. They didn't have an enormous abundance of footage or anything like that to put into the trailer, so they just shot Brosnan as Bond returning, basically saying, "I'm coming back." But at least Brosnan was one member of the cast who they knew they had as the production turned into 1997 and the clock kept ticking. Other returnees were obvious. Samantha Bond was coming back as Moneypenny. Joe Don Baker was coming back. Dame Judi Dench was coming back. Desmond Llewellyn, there was a plan for a while that this would be his last appearance as Q in the movie, but they decided not to write him out in this one. But what they didn't have was the rest of the ensemble at that point. That the villain in the film, Elliot Carver, the media mogul, was set for quite a while. The story was he was going to be played by Anthony Hopkins. That he'd been approached. He was happy with the original script that he saw. But again, there's a couple of varying stories here. One suggests that he committed and then he walked away just when he saw how much the script was changing and how much it was all in flux. The other story was actually he wanted to work with Martin Campbell again because off he went to make The Mask of Zorro instead. Wise choice, I'd suggest. I really like The Mask of Zorro. Michelle Yeoh, she auditioned and landed the role after screen testing opposite Brosnan. The two clicked very quickly, actually, and she became so popular in this film that there were serious conversations about bringing her back for Die Another Day 2 films later. But also, the problem they had was that a lot of this casting wasn't in place, even as the second unit photography got underway. So the filming started in two tranches, really, and the first bunch got underway under the eye of Vic Armstrong in January 1997. But even then, there were huge challenges here because there was a planned dramatic pre-credit sequence taking place in the mountains that would have taken Tomorrow Never Dies more towards the feel of Cliffhanger, the Rennie Harlin movie starring Sylvester Stallone. But as Roger Spottiswoode would tell the Swedish 007 site, we did all the pre-production work on that mountain climbing bit, storyboards, scenery, we had experts, but in the end it was simply too dangerous to shoot, so we decided to drop it. And instead what was substituted was the sequence that you get at the start of the film now, the vast bulk of which was shot without Brosnan, and he wouldn't come along because he was making and promoting Dante's Peak at that point to film his bits for a couple of months, until a couple of months down the line. Because the main unit filming on Tomorrow Never Dies, at a point where the release date was now set for the 12th of December 1997, would not begin until the 1st of April 1997. Now, by this stage, in fairness, months of second unit work had been completed, that Vic Armstrong had been directing sequences, but at the point Armstrong was filming that stuff, there's no villain. At this point, there was no... Also, the character of Paris Carver, Elliot Carver's wife in the film, and an old flame of Bond, well, she hadn't been cast either. That at the point Anthony Hopkins was not going to do it, there wasn't an immediate, well, this person is jumping in. And it was in the February of 1997, finally, that Jonathan Pryce agreed to sign on. I think the story was his son was a big fan of GoldenEye, but he would say too that he would acknowledge that the script that he signed on to make was not the one that ultimately he made, and he would going back to the Some Kind of Hero book, he would tell Matthew Field and AJ Chowdhury the script wasn't ready. It just wasn't articulate. There didn't seem to be any cohesion to the working days. There seemed to be little fires everywhere. There seemed to be a lot of confusion about the story. They jumped into it with too much alacrity. And Price would furthermore say that he would have it written into his contract in the future that the script that he signed up to make for a movie would be the script that would be shot. What the problem they were finding that also in the midst of all of this is because there was no wiggle room, because the cut of the film had to be locked in November 1997 in order to have time to strike all the prints. The schedule was ridiculously tight, and they really had to think on their feet an awful lot. But it also meant there were multiple units shooting at the same time. So in Mexico, for instance, there was underwater sequences that were filming. Vic Armstrong was shooting his second unit stuff. In America, in Florida, there was a separate unit shooting a parachute jump sequence. Then there was the material being shot in the UK, and all of these things were at one point going on at pretty much the same time. The back end of Tomorrow Never Dies 2, the plan was to shoot it in Vietnam, and the locations were secured after delicate negotiations with the Vietnamese government, and the crew duly went along on May the 1st, 1997 to the airport, ready to ship out and set up all the pre-production work they needed to do the filming in Vietnam, which would start taking place a few weeks later. And they lost their locations. They got the message while they were in the airport. And it was a case of they had to sit and think on their feet. Their film was out in 7 months' time. They had lost the place of a Bond film. This wasn't a small indie movie. They had lost the place in the Bond film where they were going to shoot pretty much the second half of the film. They just went to the desk and changed the tickets. They went to Thailand instead and had a matter of weeks to set things up there from pretty much scratch. Now, it should be noted that the Bond team was pretty nimble at setting up filming locations and filming premises in double quick time, because even in the UK, as they'd had with Goldeneye, they had the problem of the film came together so quickly in the end that the studio space they needed wasn't available. Now, with Goldeneye, what they'd done is they'd converted an old site at Leavesden, which has now become Warner Brothers Studio at Leavesden, but they turned that into a film studio in about 8 weeks flat. And so the logical, one of the two logical options they had was to return to Leavesden. But George Lucas had just booked that site up to shoot the first of his Star Wars prequels. Now, the natural home of Bond has always been Pinewood Studios in the UK, and that was booked up when they did Goldeneye. And in fact, License to Kill, the Bond film before that, hadn't been to Pinewood when the decision was made to shoot the entire movie overseas. There's some post-production work done at Pinewood, but no filming. And in fact, the last time a Bond movie had shot at Pinewood at this point was 1987's License to Kill, starring Timothy Dalton. As it would happen, there was room at Pinewood to accommodate the Tomorrow Never Dies on the James Bond stage, and some of the finale material was thus shot there. But also, what they had to do in terms of the UK base for it was, again, they found another disused site near Leavesden, as it would happen, which they converted into a film studio in a matter of weeks. Frogmill Studios it became, although it's not a film studios now, as I understand it. But they had this short window of time to get up and running there. As was the case when they went to Thailand, that they had to find stuff that they could mirror, that would work, that could double as Vietnam in Thai locations, and then also duplicate some of those locations and some of the imagery back in the UK, where they were building sets to try and match it, to do some of the more intense material, including a huge action sequence in the second half of the film, including a big motorcycle leap where they had to match up the stuff they'd filmed in the UK with the stuff that they'd filmed in Thailand and make it all look like it was in Vietnam. From Thailand, then, the location shoot, and from Frogmill, the film then went to the luxurious surrounds of Brent Cross Shopping Centre in London for a further stunt sequence. Now, if you've seen the film, this is the one where Pierce Brosnan's James Bond basically remote controls a car, and they were able to use the multi-storey car park at Brent Cross. I hope they paid for a ticket. I gather they're quite tight there on parking fines. that for Desmond Llewellyn's sequences as Q, his penultimate appearance in the role, well, his stuff had actually been shot sometime before. He's on location in Hamburg in May of 1997, before principal photography had begun, and it was just an opportune moment in Pierce Brosnan's schedule, whereby Brosnan was on Dante's Peak promotional duty, and they just took a day or two there and got the shots that they needed with Llewellyn meeting Bond. But going back to his biography written by Sandy Herno, Q the biography it's called, he recalled, Llewellyn would recall how Brosnan was very patient with me as I kept on fumbling my lines. I blame the director because he wouldn't let me use idiot boards. I warned him it would take hours, and it did. I think it's pretty well known that Llewellyn had his lines on boards just out of view of us viewers behind the camera, but that wasn't something that Roger Spottiswoode wanted to do, and thus those shots took a bit longer to get in the can. One further late addition to the casting of the movie was Terry Hatcher, and Terry Hatcher would come in to play Paris Carver in the movie, and for a while Monica Bellucci's name was mentioned. She'd finally get her appearance in a Bond film in Spectre a long time later, but I think it's pretty well known that Hatcher and Brosnan didn't particularly hit it off. But then Hatcher, as she came to the role, she was 3 months pregnant. She had finished shooting Lois and Clark, the Superman series, on the Monday. She'd arrived in the UK on the Tuesday. She started filming on a Wednesday, and Brosnan and Hatcher, I mean, the story was blown up quite a lot as well, because they swiftly made it all up. But Hatcher's scenes, as a result of her pregnancy, would be curtailed. There was stuff they decided not to go with, and she would give an interview sometime later on by just saying she just wasn't particularly happy with the end result of the character. In the midst of filming, Sheryl Crow was announced as singing the title song. Have to mention that because it's a Bond film. Michelle Yeoh, meanwhile, well, she was having a lot of fun, but she was used to doing her own stunts. But as she told Premiere magazine in December 1997, well, she said the producers and insurance people were pulling out their hair every time I got on the bike. The big chase sequence where she was on a bike that involved the helicopter as well, it all took 3 months to get all the bits in place. And she did manage to do some of her own stunts, but not as many as she'd like. I mean, she was used to certainly doing them on the movies that she'd done beforehand. Brosnan, well, he picked up a traditional James Bond injury during the filming. I think it's pretty well known that Daniel Craig's picked up more than his fair share of injuries while making Bond films. In the case of Tomorrow Never Dies, the injury that Brosnan sustained involved him requiring stitches on the side of his face, and that meant for a period of time Roger Spottiswoode was only able to shoot him from one side. Brosnan would continue to be frustrated through the production as well, that the script wasn't locked down, that it was all the total film set report from the time. It's quite interesting because it would make note of the fact that there was tension during filming, and this ostensibly was the bit where you go and do an on-set visit. They do at least try and make it all look calm, and there's some degree of presentation to it sometimes, but here the tensions were bubbling for. Roger Spottiswoode, in an interview that he would give sometime afterwards, would just say it's all just part of natural filming, and actually it was not a particularly horrible shoot or anything nasty like that. But nonetheless, in the end, it finally wrapped in September 1997. That's 3 months before the film was due in cinemas, and it would be a shoot that Brosnan would ultimately describe as, quote, pulling teeth. He hadn't enjoyed it. He would want changes for the next film, which would be The World Is Not Enough. But there was still this one to finish, and there'd been regular fears as the film's production went on that the release date couldn't be hit. So much so that MGM in the end posted a statement confirming that release date would be hit. I think, if anything, that goes to just how loud the chatter was that the Bond film was in some degree of threat of running late, at least in the public perception. A couple of other things that came up in post-production as well. There was talk for a while, for instance, of legendary composer John Barry returning to the James Bond franchise. What a coup that would be. But a deal couldn't be worked out in the end, not least because he wouldn't be overseeing the title song to the movie. he would ultimately pass on a return to Bond, and David Arnold would take up the job instead. The whole plot about the Hong Kong handover, I should just clarify, I mentioned it right at the start, but they decided not to go with that in the end as well, because they took advice, and the thinking was that if the Hong Kong handover in real life had gone particularly badly, it wouldn't look particularly good if a James Bond film came along and tried to do a fictional version of it at the same time. So that's why they steered away from that, and that story came out roughly around this point too. MGM's public stock offering, though, well, that was still on the cards, and thus it was full steam ahead. And to get this film into some kind of shape required multiple editing teams working together using digital editing equipment, and far less commonplace then than it is now. And it would only be about a month after physical production wrapped that a first from what I can gather, only preview screening, test screening with an audience was put together. That Spottiswoode had pushed and pushed and pushed to make sure that the running time of the film came in at under 2 hours. That was something that he really wanted. He felt GoldenEye had gone on just a little, and he was a big fan of GoldenEye, but he just felt it had gone on just a little bit too long. The single test screening that they did, the report was that the audience was pretty flat, but nonetheless, the studio felt the preview had gone particularly well, and the film didn't change an awful lot as a result of that screening, not that there was an awful lot of time to do so. Headlines also sprung up in between the wrapping of filming and the release of the movie that Sony was going to launch its own James Bond franchise, that it reckoned it had the rights to do another remake of the film Thunderball. It was a remake of the film Thunderball that had led to the unofficial Bond film Never Say Never Again. And here, just as MGM needed as much security as possible and as much good news going forward as possible, was a story of a competing 007 franchise that was potentially going to happen. Against this backdrop, and I think this is no small achievement, the film met its premiere date by the skin of its teeth, that the movie would indeed premiere on the 10th of December 1997 in London, and it would do so, it would get its wide UK release 2 days later, and then it would appear in the US on December the 19th, 1997. And in theory, that should have been a fairly straightforward release window. The last Bond had gone really well. As long as there wasn't fierce competition coming up, well, it should go particularly well this time as well. The only problem was the film that it found itself up against was one that had been delayed a couple of times and was now due out at the end of 1997. You might have heard of it. It's one of the biggest films of all time, Titanic. As it would happen as well, the two films in the US were coming out the same weekend. Brilliant. Also out that same weekend as well were Mouse Hunt. That's an underrated movie, that is. I do like Mouse Hunt an awful lot. There were small debuts for Jackie Brown and As Good As It Gets as they built up to an Oscar run. But it was Titanic that opened at number 1 in the US on December the 19th with a box office opening weekend of 28.6 million. Tomorrow Never Dies, not shabby at all, 25.1 million in second place. But Titanic just kept growing week after week after week after week. And whilst Tomorrow Never Dies didn't fail at all, it just fell slightly short of GoldenEye's overall gross, that it would take 125 million. And that was in the US, and that's about 20 million short of GoldenEye. Its overall gross, if you take in worldwide takings as well, was about $330 million. And again, not shabby at all. MGM was happy with it. That there was a feeling it could have done a bit more, but Titanic was just an unpredictable juggernaut. There was, in the aftermath of Tomorrow Never Dies, I mean, it's worth noting that it was the first Bond film to get a really deluxe DVD release, that DVD was just coming through at that point. The tie-in video game, while the tie-in video game to GoldenEye had been brilliant and is still regarded as an absolute classic, this time Electronic Arts had picked up the license, and the tie-in video game of Tomorrow Never Dies, I genuinely can't remember a single thing about it. In terms of where the Bond franchise went next, there was enough enthusiasm to quickly get another film going again, that Martin Campbell would again be invited back to direct, that Roger Spottiswoode would be invited back to direct as well. But that movie would go on to be directed by neither of them. It would be The World Is Not Enough, and I'm going to come to that story in another episode of the podcast at some point in the future. Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode, though. I'd just like to give another hat tip to the wonderful cinemaparadiso.co.uk. And if you use the code FStories at its website, then you can get 30-day free trial of its service. So that's lots of physical media delivered to your door. I think that's a very good thing. It helps support the podcast. It helps support Cinema Paradiso. And I think the world generally would be a better place for doing so. Another way to support this podcast, I mean, I am an independent. I sit in a room by myself in the West Midlands in the UK. The weather's a bit murky today, as it happens. As such, I don't have a big company or a marketing budget or anything behind me. I just rely on your word of mouth to keep going. So if you do like this podcast, please do subscribe at your podcast repository of choice and leave ideally a hugely positive review as well. These things all help Film Stories bubble up a little bit, and I hugely appreciate it. If I can give a quick plug as well to the latest issues of my print magazines, my latest for under 15s, Film Stories Junior issue 6 is now shipping, as is Film Stories issue 23. You can find out more about those at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to stop trying to sell you things. I'm going to go into the second of the two movies I'm talking about in this podcast. I'm going to play you a clip.
We're reviving a canceled undercover program from the 80s.
Where do we report to?
Down on Jump Street, 21 Jump Street.
You are here because you some Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus looking mothers. You will be going in as undercover high school students.
You have exceptional muscle tone there, young man. When'd you go through puberty? Like at 7 or something?
There's a new synthetic drug at Sagan High. The mission is find a supplier.
I think the dealers are the popular kids.
We should throw a party. That would be the quickest way to get in with them.
Come on, let's go.
Don't give nobody no drugs, no alcohol.
I promise you we'll be super professional.
All I do is party. Take it here.
That's then a clip from the trailer for 2012's 21 Jump Street, directed by Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, screenplay by Michael Bacall, story by Bacall and Jonah Hill. I should point out that the trailer that I used there was the green band one, which means all the fruity language has just been slightly silenced. This is a very family-friendly podcast, and I would hate to corrupt your minds. The film itself, well, producer Neil Moritz at this point was pretty known for reboots. He was involved with the Total Recall one, for instance. I mean, his company's called Original Film, and you can make a gag there if you want, but I wouldn't do that. And Moritz was talking, a smart man was talking to Hill's agent, Jonah Hill's agent, and she gave Jonah Hill a call saying, does he have an idea for what they could possibly do with the 21 Jump Street movie? Because 21 Jump Street at this point, it was known as the television series from the 1990s. It had actually come to life in 1987, finished in 1991, starred Johnny Depp most notably, and co-created by Stephen J. Cannell. Was it an obvious candidate for a movie adaptation? Has this podcast become one of those where someone asks a question and then just answers the question they've asked themselves? Well, no and yes. What Hill saw, though, was the idea of a film where you go back and relive high school. And he also liked the idea of just skewing that a little bit, that he felt that high school had moved on, that the bullies weren't the big jocks anymore, that the bullies were slightly snider and clever, and he wanted to reflect that a little bit. And he was interested, and he had his conversation with Neil Moritz, and all of a sudden this project seemed to have some legs. It was worth noting at this point that Jonah Hill had scored a big comedy hit as one of the stars of 2007's Superbad, directed by Greg Mottola, and so he was a go-to at this point for potential comedy roles. He's taken on quite a lot of dramatic work since then. The first announcement, though, that this one was underway came in an Entertainment Weekly news article that was published in May 2008, and it goes to the fact that there was a degree of surprise here that Jonah Hill was making this kind of jump, because the article, I'll read you the line from it, 21 Jump Street by way of ... Jonah Hill ? Yes, it's true. The breakout Superbad comic and Judd Apatow, producer Acolyte, is in negotiations to develop a movie adaptation of the popular 80s TV show starring Johnny Depp. And at this stage, Jonah Hill's involvement was he was going to work on the script and he was potentially going to executive produce the movie. It wasn't given at this point that he was also going to star in it. That by this stage too, the television series had been off screen since 1991, so a good 20 years had gone past, almost gone past at this point. So just how much affection there was for 21 Jump Street was unclear. But still, Sony did a deal with Neil Moritz and his original film company, and the project was moving forward. Stephen J. Cannell was going to come in as a producer. No director at this point was attached, but Hill reportedly wanted Rob Zombie to take the job on. That would have been a slightly different film, I'd like to contend. Now, Sony was giving Jonah Hill some wiggle room here, that Superbad had been a Sony film, and Hill told them, as he told The Complex, that he wanted to make an R-rated, Bad Boys, John Hughes type film. Now, the TV show itself hadn't been a comedy, really, but this was going to be, but also Hill very much envisaged it too as an action movie as well, and this was conditional on his involvement. Now, by May 2009, Michael Bacall had come aboard the film to co-write the film as well, and the script was coming together, the project was moving forward, it looked like Hill was going to star in it as well. Now, separately, by the end of 2009, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller as directors, well, they come to the end of a 6-year battle to make the animated film. I really like this film, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. That itself, I mean, that's a film with a story and a half behind it, because they started working on that in 2003 and got themselves fired from it. And then they got themselves rehired on it, and then they worked really closely with Sony, going backwards and forwards to develop it and beef up characters and change it. And by the time it came out in 2009, well, the film was a success. What I particularly like about the movie as well is that title card that it opens with, a film by a lot of people. I'm paraphrasing there, rather than taking a traditional director's credit. But they made it known that as they were coming off the back of this adventure to get this animated film made, that they were looking to do something completely different for their next movie. And so they'd made it for Sony. They put their names forward for the Jump Street gig. Not long after, as it would happen, they also put themselves forward for a small film by the name of The Lego Movie that was in development. But they were choosing movie ideas that on paper they just looked a bit bizarre. That had an element of how could that possibly work. But that was what attracted them to the films. They've talked about this several times in the past, about the stuff that they shouldn't be doing that just seems not to work on paper. Well, that's the stuff where they just think, well, actually, that maybe there's something there. And so, as they told Movie Hole, the website Movie Hole, said, we were obliviously not the obvious choice to do that movie. So we made a little presentation packet of what we thought the tone would be and the look of the movie would be, and what we thought we could bring to the story to make it even better. And that's what convinced Neil Moritz and the studio that we might be okay to do the job. Jonah Hill too, he was happy with what Lord and Miller were going to bring to this, and so he signed off on them as well. And what do you know, the 21 Jump Street film had its directors. They were announced in December of 2009. Before they took the job on, they did get to have a conversation with Stephen Cannell, who would pass before the movie was out. He died in September of 2010, but they'd had a conversation with him, and he liked what they were looking to do. By this stage, Jonah Hill was indeed confirmed to star in the film, and he was having to do lots of training to get into shape for it, to do a very physical action role. And it was confirmed at the end of 2009 this would be the story of cops going undercover at high school. It was going to cost around $50 million to make, so it was going to be a fairly sizable production, this one as well. But also it was in the era where Sony was able to mitigate productions to a degree too by revenues from the DVD market. That DVD sales had been going down, but they were still enough to allow the studio to take a little bit of a risk. Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, they were reported to come in and do a pre-production polish on the script, and Neil Moritz throughout hammered home the idea of keeping the plot completely focused. As Chris Miller would say, we worked on the script with Michael McCall and Jonah Hill for almost a year before we started prepping the movie, and we'd shown stuff repeatedly to Stephen Cannell, and he was very excited and on board with everything. He was really supportive of the film, and as they would say after his passing, it's a shame he won't get a chance to see it. Now, Phil Lord, he also said of their approach to the film, it's just that our approach to this was, what if we made it good? We thought that if we took it seriously and made the character and story good and try to make it work emotionally, then we could take the rest of it completely not seriously and have a lot of fun with the concept, but still do something that's an enjoyable experience where you think the filmmakers thought this was a kind of a crazy idea too, but they took it seriously enough and did a good job with it. Now, I did get to interview and speak to Phil Lord and Christopher Miller about this film. And there's a moment early in the movie where Nick Offerman's character gives a speech about resurrecting things from the past. And I asked Chris Miller about that. You heard a little bit of it in the clip at the start. And he said we definitely had our own amount of healthy skepticism about remakes in general going into it, as I think everyone should. And that particular speech just talks about we've resurrected, we've just dug up some old idea. And they put it in the movie. And Miller said, we felt that we didn't want it to be like a spoof and we didn't want it to just be serious because we felt we weren't going to compete that way. We chose a tone where we decided to let the audience know that we knew. They knew and we knew that doing a remake isn't something that should be approached without skepticism, but it's okay, relax, have a good time. It'll be all right. Now, the pair went into the film with the dream of making 21 Jump Street closer to a 90-minute movie, but they also knew that this was an action film as well. They had to fit in action sequences. And in fact, the final cut of it would come in at 109 minutes with credits. But even the credits are good in this one. They're even better in the sequel, of course. In terms of casting, well, Jonah Hill was in place, but Channing Tatum wasn't. And Channing Tatum was a gamble at this stage because he wasn't known as a comedy performer at the point he landed the 21 Jump Street gig. That if you look at the work that he was doing in the 2000s, for instance, well, he'd done Step Up and Step Up 2, for instance. He'd made G.I. Joe, and he came to 21 Jump Street off the back of making the film The Vow as well. But they saw something in him, and even though he wasn't regarded as a straight comedy actor, as soon as he and Jonah Hill got together, something clicked. And Jonah Hill didn't know Channing Tatum when he was contacted to appear in the film. They hit it off straight away. Now, Jonah Hill did know Dave Franco, and he took, the director's and filmmakers' commentary on the 21 Jump Street disc is a delight if you've not had the pleasure of it. And Hill talks in that about how Dave Franco got to the audition for his role in the movie, and Hill knew that he was the right person when, even though he was cast in the film himself, he found himself wanting to impress Dave Franco in the audition. He wanted Dave Franco to think that he was cool, and at that point sort of knew, well, he's the logical person for this. Emma Stone, for a while, she was in line to appear in the film, but by this stage she was also committed to making a different Sony venture, The Amazing Spider-Man, so had to drop out. Door open for Brie Larson to come in at that point. You get an early screen appearance too by Dakota Johnson, I should point out. And also they brought in some good comedy talent. Rob Riggle is in there, Chris Parnell, Ellie Kemper as well, Jake Johnson, Nick Offerman, who I've just mentioned before. They were all brought in to beef up the ensemble. J.K. Simmons was actually in line for the role of Deputy Chief Hardy at one point, but he had commitments elsewhere. Ice Cube, meanwhile, had the role of Captain Dixon written for him and would completely deliver on it. I think Ice Cube in the Jump Street movies is just a flat-out delight. Filming would begin then in April of 2011 in the Louisiana area of the US. And by the sounds of it, it was a fun shoot. The first day of shooting was Nick Offerman's scene with Hill and Tatum, the one that I just mentioned before, the one where they complete their first bust in the movie. Lord and Miller said that we could tell from the camera test that Channing and Jonah were going to have great chemistry, so we were all really excited. But also they were happy to allow their cast room for improvisation. There's a lot of improvising that took place on the set of 21 Jump Street, which goes to the fact that there's a lot of material that ended up on the cutting room floor, which goes to the fact that there's a lot of material that ends up in deleted scenes on the disc. There were the challenges of making a big action movie here. At one stage, they blocked off a freeway so that Jonah Hill, dressed as Peter Pan, could run along it. There were big explosions. They didn't want to skimp on any of that. The touch point of going to something like Bad Boys meant you had to deliver on the action as well. And this was new to Jonah. There's a bit on the disc where Jonah Hill is just sat in front of a very busy sequence being set up with explosions and flashing lights and ambulance. And he just sort of treats it almost as a pinch yourself moment, because at this stage he was known for his comedy work. His childhood did add some extra flavour to it as well. It should be noted that his character's house in the movie is decorated with pictures of a child, and it's all his real childhood pictures that were used to dress that particular set. His mum apparently didn't understand quite what everyone was laughing at. One person who proved to be an excellent improviser, just going back to the improvisation point, was Channing Tatum. And again, there's a moment in the film where he gets high fairly early on the drug in it, the HFS drug, and he has, let's just say, he has a sequence where the impact of that drug takes hold. It was done in one take with Tatum just being given a basic outline of what he needed to do, and then he just made it up on the spot. And again, it's just a delight. Ice Cube, he was relatively particular about what he would and wouldn't say. There's a story of a line in particular he wouldn't say. You might have to dig that one up on the disc, because obviously this would take the podcast into not family-friendly territory, and that would be dreadful. There was a little bit of animal welfare concern as well. There's a moment where there's a fish on a wall, for instance, and the filmmakers were asked to confirm that wasn't real. Apparently there's a thing where you can't wake pigeons up at night for animal cruelty reasons as well. So little things there that they had to contend with. There were hidden cameos that I don't particularly want to spoil, but there is a shootout near the end which involved 11 people and hundreds, I think 1,000 squibs in the wall, and a fake nose that Steven Spielberg particularly liked, but a fake nose that apparently ended up getting held up in customs as well, just as they were heading into production on the movie. With the film in the can, the first assembly of the film in post-production was 3 hours long, and Lord and Miller talked about how they didn't actually watch the whole film in that state because they knew straight away they had to cut this down. They knew how comedy works. You cut it and cut it and cut it and just get the timing absolutely right. But even after they'd locked their cut, and even after they were happy with it and it was playing well, there was a very, very late change to one of the lines in it. That the film had to be delivered at the end of the week, and prints were beginning to be struck as well. And there's a line where Chris Parnell, playing the drama teacher, talked originally about, quote, doing cocaine with Whitney Houston's niece. The tragic death of Whitney Houston as the film wrapped filming meant that they knew they had to change that line, that it would be inappropriate to put the film out with that. But they had to go back into ADR and come up with something that would fit. So they tried a couple of lines, just like doing cocaine with Charlton Heston's hearse. That didn't work. And the reason you get the line in the film of doing cocaine with Willie Nelson's horse, a genius line, better than anything they originally had, is because they had to come up with something that could fit at the very, very last minute. They had to abandon the prints that had already been struck, put that in, and only then could the film be finished. But other than that, it was relatively calm. And again, Lord and Miller, they said we were fortunate to have so much support on this project from the studio, from our producers to our actors. We put together a cut that everyone was pretty happy with from the start, and the test audiences seemed to respond well to. We wish we could tell you, they told me, there were huge fights with the studio where they wanted us to add a dog or something because it would make us seem like cool, iconoclastic filmmakers who fought the fat cats at the studio. But truthfully, we took a bunch of studio notes and they almost always made it better. The film opened, the reviews for it were strong. And there was a degree of surprise to it as well. I think there's a degree of nobody really saw this coming, and that it caught the nostalgia of the 80s, but also delivered a really good action comedy as well, which I think it is. I'm a huge fan of this film. And the box office, well, that delivered as well, far in excess of what originally Sony would have been expecting for this one. It opened the weekend of March the 16th, 2012 in the US, stormed to number one in the charts with a 36 million opening weekend. The other films that were around at that point were The Lorax, which was on its third weekend. That was doing great guns, actually. I'm never a huge fan of that one, but what do I know? John Carter was around in third place. Project X, which you'd suggest was working on similar audience territory as 21 Jump Street. Act of Valor, 1,000 Words, Safe House was in there, Journey to the Mysterious Island as well. But 21 Jump Street was a hit, and a sizable one as well, that by the time it finished its run in the US, it grossed $138 million. Overseas, it added another $63 million. And here was a $200 million movie that would also sell a ton when it got to disc. So much so that Sony was fairly keen, and fairly quickly keen, to look at doing a sequel for it. And in fact, a lot of the interviews by the time the film came to the UK, which wasn't long after, were about whether this would get some kind of sequel, which it ultimately, of course, did. That sequel was announced Quickly, in March of 2012, it would arrive in 2014, and Lord and Miller would be putting that one together whilst also working on the Lego movie at the same time. Both of those are stories for another time, but it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the fact that if you go to the end credits of 22 Jump Street, you are in for a flat-out treat. What I'd also suggest, though, is if you watch the entirety of 21 Jump Street, well, that's something really quite special. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can get more of my wittering on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Website, got one of those, filmstories.co.uk. Updated every weekday with film stories, with reviews, with news, with all sorts of movie nerdisms and bits and bobs. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can find a full selection of our magazines and, again, bits and bobs. Facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. We're on YouTube too at youtube.com/filmstories. As always, though, the most important thing as another episode comes to an end is you all take care of yourselves and look after yourselves as well. I hugely appreciate your support. I hugely appreciate you listening, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.
Did you say you have the right to be an attorney?
You do have the right to be an attorney if you want to.